Hi, everyone, and welcome to our week with Dr. Erick Lavigne. Today, we're talking about the administration of colleges and universities. And Erick is actually the newest faculty member in our department, but he is not new to our department. He is a graduate of our program, and he actually came to us. We were really lucky to have Erick. He came to us after years of administration and teaching in Quebec. And so he was part of the CEGEP system there, as well as has a background in engineering. So many of you will find him a really good connection point for several subjects, for professions, for leadership, administration. And you've done our politics class as well. Actually, tell me, what are the courses you have taught and what do you see yourself teaching in the next couple of years?
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for having me. The courses I've taught, so I've taught administration of colleges and universities. But I started really, let me go back and go where I start. The first course I taught was qualitative research in higher
Okay.
education. So I've really enjoyed this course. And it was the first time I was teaching master's level students as well. So that was a new grounds for me. And as you said, I came from engineering, so teaching qualitative research also was very interesting for me. And it was I mean, my research was qualitative, but it was a good way to solidify that piece of my work. So I've taught that. I've taught administration of colleges and universities. I've taught organizational change in higher ed and politics of higher ed. And I see the last three, so administration, organizations, and politics slash power, as kind of, three complementary courses. They work well together. They kind of touch a little bit. It's hard to talk about administration without talking about organizations. It's hard to talk about organizations without talking about power. And it's hard to talk about power without talking about administration. And so we keep going and round and round and round in those courses. Yeah.
So that's really helpful for those students to see them as a complement. So if that's one of the areas that you're interested in sort of specializing in this program, not officially specializing, but trying to focus your courses on, take all three. You will not cover the same ground, but you will find yourself building on the knowledge and sort of deepening the knowledge you have in all of them. So that's really, really great.
Yeah, but you can also just take one and you'll probably have enough.
Yes. Really? Okay. Well, there you go. My opinion is take them all and focus because it's like you're going to have enough of me. It's okay. Okay. So when I was looking at the readings you selected for us and some of the work that you've done, I began to realize that in this class, we talk about this historic shift. So the students actually begin the class by looking at Cardinal Newman. They look at Flexner's work. And in those early writings of Newman, the professors have a very specific role that is the power of the university. I mean, they're making the decisions. And yet we know that Newman held a different, did have more power because he's establishing the institution. But we often in the literature, you sort of feel like there's this historic idealism where you're saying, oh, back then, the professors had all this power and we just don't have it anymore. Is that true? Was there a shift from professors making all these decisions to a group of professors or administrators being selected out to make power decisions? Is that how it worked?
Well, there's many ways to look at this question. I find that's an interesting question. Today in the literature, we see a lot of articles coming up with this tension between collegiality as a way of making decision versus managerialism, which would be kind of an ideology. But collegiality is also an ideology, is that as a collegium, we're able to deliberate and make decisions on things that are sometimes outside completely of our areas of expertise. Whereas managers are understood to have specific skill sets that can bear favorably on making decisions in certain areas. And then there's always that tension, where should we? But today we see a lot of articles focusing on that. And I'll come back to your question, because in some jurisdictions, there are dramatic shifts in who become administrators and what is expected of them. So in the UK, for example, in Australia, you see a lot of the literature focusing on those aspects because they're going through what they would consider a crisis. Okay. But then you look back and you see articles from the 60s that ask the same question. Are we too far into managerialism already? So you can already see that this is not a 2020 problem. This is like a 20th century problem as well. And then you go back to Adam Smith, right? So now we're 18th century, okay? And he's asking, well, who should be leading the faculty? Should it be one of us, or should it be an outsider who's specialized? So that question has always been, right? And perhaps what we see is there's a connection between how big we are as an organization, how complicated we are as an organization, how many things we're trying to do that we're not so good at, and to what extent we're, as we get bigger and bigger, we have new challenges. So for example, running a budget is fairly simple when there's 5 of us. But when there's 500 of us and there's different departments, so I think everyone can understand quickly how then some areas where you could just be an amateur, eventually you'll need people who are specialized. You'll need people who are specialized in law, people who are specialized in accounting, and then people who are specialized in making many pieces that are not supposed to work well together, work together, right? So what I see is, well, at the beginning, you always needed support staff. You needed a little bit, right? There's just grounds to take care of. So you needed support staff. So those, I wouldn't call them as emerging, but rapidly you started seeing professional staff. So people who were under the responsibility of academic administrators, but had specific tasks, right? Specialized tasks. And then you saw the rise, and that's interesting. Then eventually those things became big enough that you had non-academic administrators starting to appear. So people who were masters of their areas and would be able to make decisions in those areas. And for example, in the US, we see a shift in the 20th century with regards to students. Who deals with students? Who's director of student affairs? Is it a dean? And slowly you see it shifting towards non-academic administrators. And now we also see non-academic senior administrators. So in some jurisdictions and in some universities and colleges, you have, like in the US, for example, there are universities where the president is a 4-star or a 5-star general, right? So that's not a professor who becomes a, I bet everyone's curious to see how those places run, right? If everyone has to salute, the trumpet is going on with the flags rising every morning and doing push-ups when the president's not happy.
That's not going to happen in our department.
Well, there you go. But you see that there's a shift. So I think this shift is continuing to happen, and maybe we can link it to changes, like I said, complexity, right? Size is increasing, the breadth of the activities that we're doing. There's a shift also in the discourse. So more and more this idea that professional managers or specialized managers can bring something to the institution, and to what extent they can bring a lot, and where should we keep that balance. But there's a shift in discourse. There's also a shift in discourse with regards to autonomy and accountability, and then that created the need to have specific tasks related to communicating with governments, communicating with accreditation agencies, and so we needed those areas to grow. I want to say it's also related to crises. So if you go through a financial crisis in your institution, like McGill went through at some point a long time ago, maybe you're more likely to want to professionalize and maybe have someone who's a non-academic director in a specific area. If you have a labor crisis, then you'll need strong people with law background, labor relations background, negotiations background, etc. So, and if your staff or your faculty unionizes, then it also will change the way you understand what kind of personnel you need for those areas. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of like Maybe I'll add one more thing, and it's related to the new goals that universities and colleges are trying to tackle. So I'll just say, if we, as a pressure from society, but also as a reflection upon our own history and what we should be doing in society, decide to embrace new ways of being and new ways of acting related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, then we need to shift our structures. We need to have people who are specialized in new areas, and then we'll grow. And then the question will always be, should it grow within the faculty or should it grow outside the faculty? Yeah, I'll stop there, but there's a lot to think about there.
There's a lot to think about. And I think almost every piece in that's going to resonate with the students who we have in this program. So of course, you know, the students you're going to meet in our live session, many of them work across the GTA and some across Canada in post-secondary. And so to see themselves, many of them hold these professional administrative positions underneath an academic who has become a senior administrator. And so they will understand that, yes, I hold some skills that that professor down the hall can't do. I now hold this specialized knowledge. So I think they're going to understand that, yes, the complexity, the breadth of activities, the size, all of these things begin to shift it in sort of slowly. And then I love that you then bring in the crises. And then what does this department have? What quirk in their staffing does this department have because of this crisis we had at point X, Y, or Z, right? And so we see that some places have extra staff members for things like international students because they draw a lot of international students where other departments don't, right? So I think that you really help the students to see where they would fit in, and also how faculty made that shift, how the different roles that professors can take or not, right? I do have a question. Oh, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, you mentioned this idea of management needing skills. And this is interesting to me because in Lumbley's work, he talks about this, the second article they're reading talks about the deep identity journey that a leader goes on. But my first thought was, do they need to go on this like identity journey, or do they need to like have certain skills to get the job done? And is there a way to balance that? Can one happen without the other? Are we going to give the Canadian answer? Well, it's a bit of both. Like, help us understand that, because I kind of felt like my head was up against that idea a bit.
Yeah, well, in her article, she highlights how the academic administrators she spoke with, okay, so that's very important, because of where they're coming from, because of their understanding of the role of administration, they have an ambiguous relation to the use of power. Right? They have a hard time acknowledging that they use influence, but when you ask them to describe what they're doing, you can see what they're doing is politicking, but not necessarily in a bad way, but just trying to make the machine run, and things happen. But they're not particularly comfortable voicing and making explicit that kind of activities. They would prefer if they didn't have to do it. That seems obvious. So I don't know if we can talk about identities in tension, or in my own work when I interviewed deans, I had the feeling not that identities were in tension, but identities were layered. That sounds, I don't want it to sound complicated, but it's not. For me, it wasn't like the faculty in me is conflicted with the administrator in me. I didn't feel that when I interviewed the deans I interviewed, which were not the same as Lumbley's deans, anyways. But I saw that they were still thinking very much like faculty members, but on top of that, they understood additional constraints. So that's why I say layered. It was like, it wasn't trying to replace, but it was like an extra layer that would bring more complexity to their thinking, because they had to take bigger pictures. They saw stuff that when they were faculty members, they never were aware was going on, because once you move into administration, the problem come to you, right? So if you're a faculty member that doesn't get into problems, then you're not going to see it. And if you're not getting into problems, chances are maybe people will think of you as the new administrator. Yeah. I don't know if that answers
I
you.
think it totally does. And I think the real heart of what Lumley's trying to communicate is this concept of how we relate to power. And are we willing to take on that power to see ourselves as someone who's now an agent to enact change? And one of the things we talk with the students in this class about is that you're the future leaders. You will at some point, not necessarily going the academic route to have a dean position, but often you'll have types of power within the positions you take. And so will they have a comfortable relationship with that? Is it something about the nature of academic work where we don't want to see ourselves as higher than anyone else that we have a harder time taking that on? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, and
yeah.
Power has been a focus in the literature for, I mean, since the Greeks. But it always depends on what we mean by power. So, and I think as a administrator or a future administrator or administrative staff and someone who's not interested in, but every person in an organization may come to realize what kind of power they have and what they can do with it. So we often talk of power as an authority, which we could call formal power or power based on your position in the structure of the organization. And then the rules, the regulations, the policies give you authority over certain domains. Okay. So that's one. But let's say you're the scheduler. Okay, you're the person who's doing the calendar and the schedules and building all those complex mix of classes and making sure all the students can take their classes. And then this person come in and says, well, we should do this. And then you speak up and say, well, I think this is not going to work. So you have expert power, which is related to your role and your background and and this is just one source. And if we think of the ability to build coalitions, then some people have networking power. So they don't necessarily have power themselves, but they know a lot of people and they can leverage those people to move their own agenda forward. So again, if we start looking at ways of influencing, then we see that there are many different types of power and that being able to act upon an organization is not only based on, what's your title.
I think that's a really helpful, and that goes to sort of some of the questions I had about who holds power in different ways, who or what forms of power do senior administrators have compared to the administrative staff, and you've really identified those different ways. I think that we can have power and influence based on who we are and what skills or what abilities we have, right? Networks we might have. That's very interesting. So are there areas that you see some of the most fights over power, the biggest power struggles in universities and colleges? Like, does everyone have it, or do we actually see that there are more contested areas? Like, I'm thinking like the budget, the parking, isn't that what Clark Kerr said? The biggest issue for a faculty is the parking lot.
Yeah. I've been in parking lot conversations when I was associate dean, so that made me laugh a lot. Like for 5 weeks of parking lot conversations. Yeah. So those exist. He wasn't just being facetious. Some models completely evacuate the notion of power and politics. And they focus on formal power, formal structures, organograms, rules, regulations, everything that's written and pinned down, that you can see artifacts of and read. But then some authors also look at the other side, how things really run. And then when they start looking at that, they see that effectively some people do have power that is related to more than their position. So for those authors, power and the interplay of power and the struggle for power and the use of power and the leveraging of power really is what explains organizations and what explains whether things happen or don't happen. Administrators are in a specific area in which they are granted by the organization formal power, right? Authority. So they can say, because I said so, we're going to do this. So they're the ones who, when everything comes together, are the ones, I often joke, they're the ones who get to decide which half of the organization is not happy with their work and which half is happy with their work, right? So they have that privilege. Now, in academic settings, it becomes a lot more complicated and I think more rich, more interesting, because the formal power that administrators have, especially those responsible for academic areas, is very thin. And because tenure and academic freedom and complexity, and you've studied loose coupling in your course, and so the fact that all these different areas of the organization do not work well together, first of all. Second, because faculty can do whatever they want. Third, because we don't necessarily have good answers as to what we're supposed to be doing. So for example, what's the best way to teach? What's the best way to do research, right? What's the best way to promote student experience and learning experience? Because those things are still like very loose and specific to each course and perhaps specific to relationships and students, and they keep changing in time. So we haven't pinned them down really. So it's hard to say, well, we should do it that way. So that's another reason. So in academic setting, the notion of formal power is very thin. And then it's more interesting because then things like influence, things like legitimacy, things like rhetorics, things like networking, building coalitions, committee meetings, they tend to be more rich in terms of deciding what happens. Yeah.
That's really helpful. So you're not going to tell us then that the student financial aid place is the crisis maker. It's, or that the,
No,
but I do
they
see,
can all be crisis
yeah.
maker. They give them enough. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you've given us an image of this idea of a formal authority being thin. You've talked about things that we can't pin down, which is really helpful. And we've talked, and just the weeks before you've come, about quality assurance and how can we ensure that this high academic standard that we're trying to reach is matched by learning opportunities in the classroom to help students reach those, right? And so that's not something, when we look at who gets to control that, that's an easy decision. There are a lot of moving factors, from the academic counselors to the professors to the students, sometimes their parents.
Right. But yeah, and if we want to scratch this even further, who determines, so who has power over the definition of quality? Because when you read the stuff from the Association of Colleges and Universities, and if you read the manual on what universities are supposed to be doing to be considered, quality institutions, you read this and you're like, whoa, this is written by faculty. And this is written in a way that, what we're doing is great. So if you're doing that, because I worked in a place that was trying to do something different, which I thought was better, but it didn't fit in the boxes of quality assurance. So that made me think that's interesting, because the notion of what is considered quality can be contested, but here it has been institutionalized, and those who control it are faculty members, right?
So can you give me an
that's
example? Can I poke you for a specific example of what you thought that was,
yeah,
you were doing better but didn't fit into, say, an academic's view of quality assurance, quality?
it's been a long time, but I remember that so for example, for a program, let's say, of preparing future teachers, okay, and you want to have a certain approach to teaching and projects and how students will take courses and what kind of courses they will take, then you have to submit this to a group of faculty member experts that are coming from outside who will judge what you're doing. But these guys are coming from their own establishment, their own institutionalized practice, and they're actually not expert in pedagogy. And they're not expert they're just people who have been doing it for a while, but they haven't studied it. And yeah, well, in academia, there's always the and there's articles on this, I mean, from the 50s or 60s, where, isn't it ironic that people who teach future professionals are not professionals in that field, right? And who should be teaching that?
And this is a big
Anyway,
debate. It's a huge
yeah, this is another big debate. Yeah.
and one that the students were able to look at a little bit in their curriculum and teaching week. But this is really nice to have the questions of power layered onto that, because it really goes into decision making, right? So it's super great. So I'm going to ask you one last question before we sign off. This has been great. So what do you think the major issues that are facing senior administrators, so the deans, the provosts, the chancellors, the presidents, and their vice presidents, what do you think the major issues facing these senior administrators are in the fall of 2022 as we come out of COVID?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure. What I would say is, so if some of the students watching this are in administration or interested in administration, they might have read some books on leadership, on how to be a better administrator. There's a lot of stuff on that out there, and it's all about making the right decisions and doing the right things, and engaging people and having a vision, and it's actually complete, and being authentic, and truthful, and it actually makes no sense. So I think senior administrators, yes, they do have to make a difference, but they have to make a difference in a way that doesn't put their institution on fire first, okay, and then doesn't get them fired themselves. And so you can come up with all these great ideas and have this vision, but if you can't understand how to work the culture, if you can't understand how to pace yourself in some ways, and to figure out what is really the priority and what should be forgotten, then first of all, you run the risk of just thinning yourself into a burnout, but also to create enough resistance that you'll lose your position, and therefore your ability to change things. So I think it's yes, it is very important that administrators have strong values, etc., etc. But it's also important that we select those people, and that we kick out the ones who don't. And I don't know that we have the best systems to do that, to properly select the right administrators and get rid of those that do not fit once we know them better. That being said, for me, it's always been, you have all these great prescription on what you should be doing, most of which you endorse, but then how do you do that without losing yourself in it?
Absolutely. And I really love that you're mentioning institutional culture and these less tangible things than just what's on our resume, right? It's our ability to read the community that we're leading. And at OISE, it's such a unique community, I find, because we have so many programs, but so decentralized. And we're looking at everything from classroom teaching to incredible activism in our adult ed and our social justice sectors. So you actually have a lot of sort of education being a very formal and traditional institution alongside some of the most cutting edge and progressive work on rights and equity, right? So a fascinating thing. I'd love to know, we probably got to sign off. I've got some more meetings today and we should wrap this up. The students only want to listen to us go on and on. But one of the questions I might ask you in our live session is about the disciplines. Like, is it different? Leadership must be so different when you're in an education faculty versus Rotman's, because they actually would have a very particular view. So I might ask you that in class, and I might edit this part out. Okay, so I'll take my little steps. I'm going to wrap this up here. So thank you so much, Erick, for joining us. It's great to have you. I want everyone to come live and come and ask Erick your questions. I would like you to prepare 2 questions each so that you have something based on the readings that you can follow up. It can be from your own experience, can be related to the readings, or something you didn't understand. That's always the best questions, or what we genuinely didn't quite get. So we look forward to having a great discussion with you. Erick, yes.
Am I allowed also to have 2 questions for them? Okay.
Absolutely.
I will.
Yeah, yeah. He's going to bring you guys questions too. All right. So thanks so much. And we'll be in touch. Take care, everyone.